This episode of The Clear Out was recorded on the 8th of May 2024 at home in Wicklow. And it is the first part, and I'm not sure when the second will be. It might be as soon as next week. It's the first part of an exploration of masculinity, manhood, being a man. And as usual with my approach, just letting the thoughts and discussion points evolve organically as I think in my seat. It goes to some areas I wasn't entirely planning to go to, but I tried to paint a bit of a backdrop and address the current moment and maybe some of the implications of the current moment for men of a certain kind. And ultimately, the episode really becomes a reflection on what I received as a model of masculinity that I was sort of encoding unconsciously as a young guy, and how I recognise that now and who I attribute that to. And I discuss my own conception of a masculinity that I value. And so the conversation is very much begun but unfinished. And as I said, in the next part, whether it's next week or soon, I'll try and further explore my thoughts on this topic, which I'm particularly interested in. So if that sounds like it might be your thing, stay with me and get into it. I'll see you around the corner. Cheers.
Ooh, not gonna change my mind, leaving the dream behind, keep my moji inside.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear and you're listening to The Clear Out. You're very welcome. I hope this finds you well. How are you? It's a straightforward question, isn't it? How are you? How are you getting on? What's going on? Are you on the up, or are you on the down, or are you in a holding pattern? Are you flying in circles high above an airport that you have not been given permission to land in? What is going on? That's the inquiry. That's the line of inquiry here. Always is it? It's the how are we? It's the why are we? It's the when are we? Time is relevant, isn't it? Not relative, although it can be relative as well. But it is relevant. The time you find yourself in your life, the time you find yourself in history. And maybe in a way that's the germ of the idea that I'm working with today. It informs what I'm planning to speak about, which is fundamentally the question. The question is, what is a man? And I was thinking about this yesterday. There's lots of different reasons I'm thinking about this, but I was thinking about this yesterday and I was asking myself, that does seem to be a question that comes up, maybe not as explicitly as that, but there's a lot of interrogations of masculinity and manhood and maleness out there in the discourse. Sometimes it's not as direct a form of address as that. Sometimes maybe it's tangential to larger discussions of, power and the culture wars, identity politics. Toxic masculinity, of course, is very much out there in the world as an established idea and perception of certain types of male behavior. And it seems there can be a lot of rhetoric to the effect of, what's wrong with men? What's wrong with men? What's wrong with boys? What's wrong with young men? Where has it all gone wrong? What's the answer? And certainly that type of rhetoric has, I think, made a lot of men feel very alienated. And without kind of conflating this all too quickly, there's certainly a sector of men who are not only alienated but somewhat susceptible then to radicalization, and who embrace a type of weaponized masculinity that is barely disguised misogyny, that ticks, I think, a very limited box of what it means to be male, and adheres closely to a version of masculinity that is very muscular, that is very dominant, that is very unyielding, and extremely dogmatic to the point of being, fundamentalist, to the point of being brainwashed. That's the radicalized nature of it. But I feel that it just, I don't know, it's just a shape. It's just a shape. It's just a suit of armor that, appeals to a certain number of men or a certain type of man, which doesn't really address underlying issues of self-worth or insecurity or purpose or uncertainty, identity, acceptance, social integration, personal responsibility. It's it's a quick fix. Now, let's be clear. I've spoken about this before on the podcast. In viewing it through particular lenses. Obviously, I continue to be involved in the long-running community arts project, which is called What Does He Need?, which is a joint venture that was originated by the artist/academic Fiona Whelan, by Rialto Youth Project in Dublin, and by the theatre company Broken Talkers. And I did a play with Broken Talkers, which was a theatrical rendering of the project. And the project fundamentally is an interrogation of masculinity, particularly in young men, and what young men are being exposed to, and how it shapes their understanding of maleness, masculinity, of men. And I'm also involved in other aspects of that work, where I've been working with a couple of different youth projects, working with young men to try to create an avatar, I suppose, a representation of their experiences, their perceptions, their insights, their beliefs about what it is to be male in their own communities, and that is ongoing. You heard me speak a few episodes ago about a great trip I had over to St. Helens in England, where I was one of a group of people, including the guys I just mentioned before, to present work and present the ideas and experiences of the What Does He Need project. And so there's hopefully an opportunity to continue that work over there in St. Helens with Heart of Glass, a community arts group. We're doing a lot of good work over in that part of the world. So, that's a very explicit area of involvement and declared interest on my part in masculinity. on the back of that work, I've recently enrolled in a course in men's studies. It's just a short course, an online one. Kind of a gender studies primer, I suppose, in men's studies. And that has further stimulated this line of thinking. But it's, the starting point often, it seems, with these projects is just that very simple question that I asked a few moments ago. What is a man? Or if you want to load it, what is a real man? The real just connotes so many different things. That can be an extremely, an extremely triggering word. I'm not triggered by it. But the idea that there is a real man, what does that mean? Is that just from an anatomical, biological point of view? Is that more how somebody presents as a man and their version of masculinity and maleness? Does it adhere to older ideas of unreconstructed masculinity, very sort of, alpha male behavior, being the top dog, the dominant man, someone who uses his body in a certain way, someone who conducts himself in a certain way, someone who is unafraid to use aggression or violence to deal with threat, enemies, those who would usurp him. Someone, I don't know. This is the question I want to kind of look at today and explore. I've given myself about an hour. I'm not sure that'll come close. This might end up being part 1 of 2 of 3. I've no idea. But I'll just see how far I get on this line of inquiry. I remember when I first met the guys at Broken Talkers in relation to the play we did last year, Manifest. We had a little workshop, morning to meet some of the other people who were potentially going to be involved. And that was, I think that was the starting point for our workshop process that day. What is a man? And my own reaction was, well, fundamentally I felt it was impossible to answer. And I just felt it's almost a disingenuous question. And maybe, that was probably a projection on my part, but I feel the question is so limited in a way that it doesn't allow for the complexity and the many possibilities of what a man might be or how a man might present. And I suppose my position really was to kind of reject the question, and basically say it's not fit for purpose. But that, in a way, is that's its own kind of cop out. That's not actually addressing the issue. And you've heard me before, if you listen to the podcast, you've heard me before say I'm quite critical of the term toxic masculinity. And I feel that has become such a fixed and accepted idea and way of thinking around men and masculinity that it's become a sort of just a very convenient conflation that people will go, oh well, if there's any hint of behaviour I don't like in a man, that's toxic masculinity. I find it very reductive. And it's not that I can't look at or acknowledge or see or recognise the types of behaviours that people will go, well, that's toxic masculinity, which is, largely a very misogynistic presentation of masculinity. That's definitely a significant part of it. There's a sort of a rhetoric involved in toxic masculinity that suggests that women are the enemy, that they are to be gamed or manipulated to satisfy the needs of men at no cost to men. Because I think part of the rhetoric that has been successful in that area has been to convince a lot of men that women are the enemy, and that women just want to control men and change men and not let men be who they are, or steer men down a very neutered, emasculated road where they're just the helpmates of women. I don't personally believe that. That hasn't been my experience in life. But there's a lot of guys out there who seem to have just accepted that as a truth, and then that that idea takes hold, and these men are susceptible then to the influence of very dubious male spokespeople. I'm thinking of people like Andrew Tate. I was going to say Jordan Peterson. I kind of hesitate to throw him in there. Jordan Peterson also feels like a bit of a spent force. I think he really had an incredible moment there where he was kind of at the apex of the discourse around so many different issues. I always found him a very found him a very dubious kind of character with very dubious ideas, or just ideas that weren't that revolutionary, but he really captured a moment, and obviously enjoyed an enormous moment of kind of notoriety and popularity, but I feel he just became this kind of bête noire of the left, of liberals, because he was unapologetically outspoken on issues and phrased them in a certain way that were quite provocative, and people just they just couldn't handle it. And then I think a lot of his rhetoric was appropriated by this quadrant of younger males, it seems, predominantly, and particularly his book, the 12 Rules, where he lays out his template for a certain type of living, and I just kind of thought a lot of the ideas were just very kind of commonsensical, personal responsibility, living with a certain amount of discipline and rigor. I just thought, okay, yeah, is this really revolutionary thinking? Tidy your room, wash yourself, stand up straight. I just felt, what's all the fuss? But that that does speak to that. What I feel it illustrated was he was speaking to or satisfying a vacuum. There was a vacuum of something for a lot of men, and the vacuum seemed to be one of fatherhood, of a paternalistic influence. The vacuum was also one of purpose. The vacuum was one of validation, and that to me then is why I said maybe this is an issue of when. It's about timing. And at this time, which is what the world and how the world moves and how we as humans interact with each other and understand each other, so much of it has been coloured or deflected or deviated or perverted through technology and through this kind of tech age and through social media and through devices and through digital media. And it's been a very skewing stimulus, or a very skewing factor or element that has had enormous and still yet to be fully understood impact on human behaviour and human socialisation, and really on every aspect of how we live. Part of that story is with the evolution of technology and the hyper evolution of technology, the advent of AI, the improvement in automation and robotics, that has made or created a very palpable threat to work that men used to do. And not only men, let's say, in some of those cases, women as well. If I'm thinking of something like a factory work or production line work, that kind of thing. But the world has changed. The world has changed. It is changing. It's changing fast, and certain roles in society have been outdated, outmoded, have become obsolete, or are under threat of obsolescence, and many men are feeling that kind of squeeze. Now, that's kind of its own separate discussion. But to bring it back to what is a man, like this vacuum that I spoke about a moment ago, the idea of, who am I? What's my purpose? What's my function? And as a man, can I not depend on a given approval by society and a given status by society that maybe was taken for granted in the past, and maybe in the not that distant past? It's kind of like how have men been outmoded, and has the primacy of the man in society, in business, in the family, in politics, in whatever it might be, has that been outmoded? Now, I think just a cursory glance around the world, I mean, a lot of the power holders, a lot of the gatekeepers, they're still men, So, I mean, I don't think things have changed that much. But certainly on what kind of level are we talking here? Just I suppose, if you come back to, the idea of the discourse, and if you can't see how discourse is connected to the proliferation of social media, just think about it for a second. Think about it. And I'm sure I've made this point at different times before. If you consider 30, 40 years ago, if you're a younger listener than that, you can't really consider it, but how many sources of information did we have? How many sources of information? Where were we getting our news? Where were we getting our information? Where were we finding out about the world? Where were we finding out about what was happening in our part of the world? What was happening in our country? What was happening in our community? Where did we get that information? How long did we have to wait before finding out about things? The quickest way you could hear about anything would be probably the radio, breaking news on a radio station. Otherwise, you'd be waiting for the scheduled, news broadcasts on television. You'd wait for the paper the following morning, because today's paper is always telling you yesterday's news. And then otherwise, it would be someone who knew of something in your circle of friends, your community, and they would phone you. When I was growing up, I feel like where I was growing up, there were definitely houses that didn't have phones. I even knew one or two houses where my parents built their house. There are one or two houses that didn't have power. Now that's pretty extreme. That's pretty extreme. But it wasn't mind blowing or anything. It was like, it felt like contextually, it was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Those guys grew up at a certain time. I'm talking about like rural bachelor brothers or something like that. In a pokey old cottage, and they're like, yeah, we're grand. we don't need any of that. It wasn't that unusual, and so that was what the 80s. Now I realize, even though time plays tricks on us, and part of my brain goes, yeah, the 80s, that's only a couple of years ago, and you go, no, that's like 40 years ago. Which is nearly half a century. But the point I'm trying to make is that the deluge of information we get now, the deluge of stories, the deluge of new opinion pieces, new scandals, new attitudes, changing this, changing that. There's a sort of a hysteria that it can be very connected to. It's, as I've said before many times, it's a constant provocation. It's a constant adjutant that's just designed to needle us and unsettle us and make us nervous. And in a way, if you think of the profit motive papers, magazines, they just wanted to shift units, get people buying more. So the tabloids have operated on that principle for years. Put something sensational on the cover, get people, grab them by the throat, and make them feel they can't not buy this paper. And that model it's rife on the internet. It's rife across social media. I never used social media really until I started the podcast, and then I felt obliged to try and put up some basic promotional material once a week for the podcast. And so I set up accounts on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, now X, and I've completely stopped using Twitter. I get little Twitter notifications on my phone, and they are always half of a sentence, but they are always someone who is basically in the middle of a fight, or protesting about something, or in the middle of expressing, extreme anger or criticism. It's so, it's so salacious is the wrong word, but Twitter is designed to cause shit. That seems to be it. it's just constantly people fighting with each other, squabbling, taking pot shots. It's bloody awful. So I just see the icon come up on my phone. I just kind of get rid of it as quickly as possible. And what I was there, what I was trying to say before was that the idea that the role of men, or the roles of men, the position of men, the status of men has been relegated, demoted, outmoded. It's most clearly seen, I think, in the discourse, and the discourse is basically the ongoing conversation that happens online, and it can be, the people who are shrieking the loudest who get most airtime. And if you've listened to this podcast at any point over the last almost 3 years, I'm not a shrieker. far from it. If I could just insert myself into the discourse, with a prominent platform for a millisecond, I'd be saying something that is completely unpopular, which is basically, can we all just settle down and just think about this and stop getting so hysterical and stop, control this urge to destroy everybody else. I want to kill all my enemies. I want to destroy everyone who's not in my tribe. It's such a tribal space, the online space. But like everyone is just retreated to their silos, and then they just launch missiles constantly from the safety of their silos. And listen, it's bloody awful, isn't it? Isn't it? Do you love it? And then I look on Instagram and I just see comedians doing extremely well. Because people are like, oh, thank God, it's just somebody being funny. It's just somebody telling jokes. Isn't this wonderful? And then certain wellness practitioners seem to do well also. But look, anyway, whatever. So look, to come back to the fundamental question, what is a man? I don't know. I mean, like that's the question. And, and as I said, I started looking at this, at an academic level, and the fundamental position is that masculinity, and I presume this is true for femininity as well, femaleness, womanhood, woman. It's a construct. It's a social construct. The idea of this is what a woman is. This is what a man is. I think there's an acceptance on a basic biological anatomical level. We can go, well, that is a man because of those body parts, and similarly, we can go, that's the female of the species for the same reasons. Anatomical difference, which is also the anatomical compatibility, and it's the reproductive compatibility, and then there's the different allowances of hormones, chemicals, etc. And on that level, you go, okay, well, that's male, that's female. But we are so far, we're so far beyond that. And that is sort of that's what's raging out there in the world at the moment. In certain areas. Whether that's getting into the transgender arguments, the transgender discourse, the transgender controversies, whether it's just gender fluidity, whether it's queerness, whether it's children being allowed to wear different the previously assigned uniforms of the other. This stuff is just kind of becoming more and more this stuff. That's a very belittling way to refer to that, and I don't mean to. But what is happening is the demonstration of, the presentation of gender identity has become, over a very short period of time, I would argue, much more acceptable, much more visibly demonstrated, much more integrated. And I for one, I'm like, yeah, great. Let's just get on with it. Let's just keep going. Let's just keep moving forward. I know it's not as simple as that. And I think I cited something a few months ago whereby homophobic attacks have never been higher in Ireland. And so that tells a different story. So there's resistance. There's resistance to change. And I always find myself scratching my head, or maybe not my head, but maybe my chin, and wondering, what's this about really? Where is the perceived threat? What is the danger? And why does a certain type of man feel threatened by this stuff? Or is the man threatened by lots of other things, but then chooses to direct his anger at easy targets? Because maybe it's much more difficult to look at oneself and try and go, well, what can I do? Like, what's my capacity in all of this to address my own issues, my own fears, my own anger in a way that doesn't express itself negatively towards others? And that's a very sort of, I think that's a very deep psychological problem. I don't think that's exclusively a problem for men, by the way. And this is where I become unstuck, because I'm not especially caught up in my own sense of my own masculinity. It's not really ever where I've kind of pitched as a person. So maybe, I don't know, maybe that's probably, that's probably my starting point, being the child of hippie parents, means that I was exposed to iterations of masculinity that were probably less conventional, more relaxed, not particularly dominant. Men who were the men I was exposed to, my father obviously would be. I was just talking to my aunt about this recently, and I realised, all right, my father would be my main model of masculinity, and one of the most influential men in my life as a model of, that's what a man is. And my father still is a pretty mellow sort of character. He was someone who was I think he was very typical of a man born in the early 40s. I mean, he had probably fundamental chauvinistic wiring on a level. So, there's probably ingrained sexist attitudes. And yet, as I saw growing up, and even as an adult, they didn't really present themselves in unpleasant ways or discordant ways. My father always seemed equally comfortable in the company of women as of men. He liked the female friends of my parents, female family members. On one level, my father was simply, I think, a hedonist. In terms of he liked parties, he liked socializing, he liked to drink, he liked to smoke. Certainly as a hippie, he wasn't afraid of illicit substances. But it was all, it was all tethered to a sort of a liberalism, if not necessarily a total libertarianism. But there was tolerance. I felt things were always quite moderate, not excessive, barring the occasional big party. Liberal ideas, leftist ideas, socialist ideas, politics, history, that was all part of my father's world. My mother's as well, that was in the household. And my father wasn't especially demonstrative. He wasn't really a hugger or a cuddler, but he was warm and he was easy and he was quick to laugh. And he was always very approachable. And, he was the kind of guy who just he sort of stuck to his own course, and you'd go to him. He wasn't really coming to you. And, I recognize now that there's kind of a selfishness in that. He kind of suited himself. And yet he epitomized to me a sort of an easygoingness and a kind of an acceptance. Like, he wasn't someone to pontificate or hold forth or get highly indignant or irate about things. It was always very okay. But I think that was also, like, as long as it wasn't affecting him, he could be sort of philosophical, and I definitely have a lot of that in me as well. I don't really have the hedonistic side, but and also, like, he wasn't an angry man. I'd say, like, objectively, I'm a much angrier person than my father was. For lots of different reasons, and some of that is childhood related stuff. There's definitely anger and fieriness on my mother's side of the family, and I've got a lot of that. And that's that's an ongoing negotiation. I have anger for other reasons as well. And don't get me wrong. I'm not putting myself out there in the world going, I'm the angry guy. I don't think I am the angry guy. I'm telling you here, just in the spirit of transparency and being honest and open. I know I have anger in me in a way that my father didn't seem to. My father was not a violent man. I think that's very relevant. So he wasn't violent. He wasn't macho. I never saw him puffing his chest out or trying to be demonstrative in that way. He was just very quietly a man, and he did men's work. He was a carpenter, ultimately. Like, he'd been a bus driver, also arguably quite a male role. He became a cabinet maker and then carpenter, woodworking contractor in his 30s, and that's what he did until he was physically not really able to work anymore, which is only in the last 10 years, I think. And so he was also that relationship. I can't not think of my father when I think of wood, when I think of carpentry, when I think of wood, when I think of sawdust, woodworking tools, bench saws, skill saws, planes, whatever it might be. The smell of varnish, his workshop, and his relationship to nature. You know, he was a lover of nature, not an outdoors man as such, like not a hiker, not a mountain climber, not an adventurer, but really, you know, someone who appreciated nature and enjoyed it. You know, I think when I think I've been on walks with him as a kid, and just like knowing certain trees, particularly that kind of knowledge of trees and wood was a particular thing, and you know, there was a real simplicity to how my father kind of conducted himself and how he was. It was very sort of stripped back. And I've probably, you know, I've certainly romanticized it a bit. And yet, you know, you just look at it for what it was and look at it for what it is. He's been pretty constant. And the one thing that's been fascinating about my father to me is that having not been demonstrative in terms of affection or expressing himself that way for most of his life, once he turned 70, I'm trying to think, he's 81 now, so yeah. After he turned 70, he just started being a bit more expressive and would actually verbalize his feelings and his affection. You know, nothing, you know, no Oscar speeches or anything like that, but just it was just much more clearly there. And I find that very interesting, just in terms of, okay, what triggered that, you know. And I've never asked him. I probably won't. It's like, okay, that's grand, you know, that's nice, that's just a nice little development. You know, fundamentally he still just does not deviate from his course. He just wants what he wants, and as long as he gets what he wants, he's a very happy, easy guy. It's you know, it's very babyish in a way, you know. I just want what I want, and then I'll sleep nice and snuggly buggly, and then pick me up and give me a love, and then give me some food, give me some drink, let me play with my toys, and that's it. Put me back to bed. I'll go back in the cot. It's a little bit like that. And then if he doesn't get what he wants, my younger brother is at home and does a huge amount of work for my parents, and you know, he's fundamentally there as a carer. And yeah, he knows if my father's not happy, you know, his phone doesn't stop ringing because because my father wants what he wants. He needs his needs met right now. Anyway, it's funny. I had I've got distracted now talking about my father, but I took him down to the village for a haircut yesterday, and I had my daughter with me and a friend of my daughter's, and we were waiting for my father to come out of the barber's, and out he came, and you know, he'd been scalped, you know, beard trimmed back to nothing, and you know, absolutely, you know, short back and sides, and he walks out of the barber, and he's like, I can see, he's like, you know, look at me, don't I look amazing? And my daughter spotted immediately, hold on, where are his glasses? And sure enough, he didn't have his glasses on that he'd entered the barber with. And then I was looking at him going, didn't he have a walking stick as well? So I went into the barber and had to, you know, pay the difference. My father only had a little bit of cash on him, so I paid for the rest of the haircut. And sure enough, my father's glasses and his phone were, you know, in front of where he'd been sitting. His cane was in the corner, a walking stick, in fact, not a cane. And yeah, so he is like, look, my father has dementia, so it's you know, these things, it's easy to miss, but it's amazing what he does remember. So he's got this strange, it's like a split system. The stuff he remembers and is really lucid about, and then the stuff that just is, you know, falls from his, you know, his hands, you know, like a pebble falling to the ground. Yeah, but anyway, the point that I'm making is, for me, that was my model of masculinity, and I didn't I only articulated that to myself in the last couple of weeks as part of an exercise I was doing on this course that I'm studying. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. You've heard me speak before, if you've listened to the podcast, about the primacy of safety in relationships, and you know, the primacy that I feel, that I attach to safety in all my important relationships. You know, the people I really care about, I really love, the people I want to spend time with. Safety. Like, yeah, okay, connection, sure, and attraction for whatever reason, you know, compatibility, personality-wise, interest-wise, connection, chemistry. But if safety isn't part of the deal, I'm out. I'm not interested. And the fundamental truth of, or certainly how I think about, you know, my upbringing, childhood, adolescence, particularly adolescence, that's probably a more accurate area to focus on. But my father remained safe. He was always safe. He was a safe person to be with. And I'm talking about like emotional safety, psychological safety. Physical safety was never really, you know, an issue. And, you know, I'm aware that that's a lovely thing to be able to say, and it's not true for everyone. But, you know, my mother wasn't safe. And, you know, she wasn't safe because of her own personality, her own history, her own trauma, her own inability to control her anger, and her demons. And she wasn't a safe person to be around. And not a lot has changed, you know, over the years. I mean, I know where that's come from. I know the reasons behind that. I know her story and her childhood story, and that's real stuff. But you know, I feel myself, my brothers, we paid the price for damage that was done to my mother. And then the dynamic between my mother and my father, you know, look, I'm not here to lay out my family history, and that's a bit unfair as well to other parties who might not want that stuff put out there. But I'm trying to tell you without telling you. So what's interesting to me about my father and his model of masculinity, which was a very straight, very hetero model, you know, a lover of women, you know, a man who used his hands for work, you know, a lover of nature, interested in books, interested in history, design, architecture, a man of ideas, a man of philosophy. There's huge crossover. I go, okay, yeah. I see so much of that now, and you know, there's things I got from my mother as well. You know, my love of film, much more would have come from my mother than my father. Like, my mother was interested in films, interested in movies, and would point stuff out to me, you know, in terms of, you know, ones to watch and ones that had been awarded and all the rest. In a way, my father wasn't that interested in that, really. That wasn't where his relationship to movies and music, it was almost kind of coincidental. You know, it was coincidental, circumstantial. Yeah, great. He'll go, he'll see, he'll do. He took me to the movies. They're very fond memories of my dad taking me to movies. I remember seeing Frantic, Roman Polanski's Frantic. My dad took me to see that, you know, because I was a huge Harrison Ford fan. I think that was that 1990? It was around then. And, you know, I'd seen Harrison Ford. You heard me speak about Witness a couple of weeks ago. I'd seen Harrison Ford kind of start to evolve and progress and, you know, take on different roles that weren't either Han Solo or Indiana Jones. And Frantic was another one of those, which I remember. Yeah, I did rewatch Frantic at some point in the last 15 years. Fine, you know, there were nice moments in it. I don't know if how well, you know, the whole thing hangs together. But anyway, But yeah, I seemed to sort of code a lot of my father's modeling of masculinity. And, to be fair, like, he was a type, and, kind of a educated hippie type who was unafraid to get his hands dirty, do manual work. And a lot of the male friends of my parents who came into the house were like that as well. So, they were nice guys, they were funny guys, they were educated guys, they travelled, they were worldly, and I liked them. I liked them all. The vast majority of them I liked. And they were nice men. They were nice older men to be around. They were nice adult men to be around. And they were massively influential on me. And what's funny to me is that I could look at my I've got 3 brothers, 1 older, 2 younger, and those guys I have to tread carefully now. But I'm not sure, I'm sure they'd recognise what I'm describing. I'm sure they'd recognise what I'm describing. But at least 2 of those brothers did not reproduce that type of masculinity, and in fact leaned quite hard into a more conventionally alpha / macho sort of masculinity. And that's interesting. Like, I was trying to go, so what is it? Like, what are the impressions that are made on you that would lead you to emulate one type of masculinity over another? And of course, this maybe then raises the question of nature versus nurture. And, what's in you innately, and how that interacts, responds to, or resists the environment and the people that are around you when you grow up. And also it raises the question of when that sort of formation of identity really kicks in. When that formation of identity really asserts itself, and what it's asserting itself in response to. And I think for a lot of men, for a lot of boys, it's, it can often be attritional. It can often be attritional because the modes of male behavior are often attritional. And there is, there are testing zones. There are testing flashpoints for all boys when they come up against other boys. And it's like, fundamentally, like, let's see what you're made of. And that can be a sort of a sink or swim experience. And, I don't know what are the options? You go head to head and go, I recognize this for what it is, and if I don't assert myself or stand up for myself, this will be reputation making, reputation ruining. This is your chance not to have that stamp put on your back that says, lesser, I suppose. Or do you try to get on side and be on the same side as the challenger, the aggressor? What are those other pressures? Do you just try to remove yourself from that field of engagement completely? And I'm not trying to speak too abstractly here. I'm talking about, playground fights, classroom fights. Often it's fights. Often it's slagging or fights or provocation. It could be on the street of the village where you grow up, or the streets of the town where you're in school, or the suburb where you're growing up, or whatever. It could be on the stairs, passing someone on the stairs, in school between classes. And I know that there's a whole other dimension to where confrontations can happen and where provocations can be put out there when you start looking at what social media has opened up for those who want to, make a name for themselves or destroy somebody else's name or whatever. So, I find myself asking myself, I'm kind of thinking about my brothers and go, okay, so what were their circumstances? And of course, I know a lot about their circumstances and what they were exposed to and what they had to come through. Now, I'm on the outside looking at that. I don't know what their internal experience of that was. I know my older brother, he responded very strongly to our economic situation, which was not good. There wasn't a lot of money, and he was very eager to get out in the world at a young age and make money. My younger brother had a hard time in secondary school, and then he sort of overcame whatever that sort of trauma was or those challenges were. Well, as I see it, he overcame it by really asserting himself in very conventionally male domains, particularly sport, rugby, and then in the world of drinking, which is, of course, a great testing zone. Can you hold your drink? Very, as I say, very kind of typically male areas of competition and combat. I sit here as someone who went into the world of martial arts. For me, the attraction of martial arts, I completely romanticized what martial arts would be. I completely romanticized it. I had it stuck in my head that there is an ideal martial artist and a sort of a master of martial arts. That ideal was probably very much connected to someone like Bruce Lee. From a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s, you can't not be affected by the iconography of Bruce Lee if you're a movie watcher. Later, martial arts action heroes, maybe someone like, I don't know, Jean-Claude Van Damme. We're not talking about acting ability here. We're talking about the type of characters that these guys played. Even awful guys like Steven Seagal. It was the sort of, you come back to Luke Skywalker. I spoke about this at the start of the year when I was talking about, the formation of identity in myself and being 50 and, Luke Skywalker, that's a martial arts character. Don't kid yourself. It's the martial arts master. The Jedi is a martial arts master, controlling the emotions, controlling the mind, being expert at wielding weapons, being a very quiet, stoic, silent killer, and a kind of a badass that you're fundamentally peaceable. You're walking the path of peace. It's not the warrior path. It's the peaceful warrior, and that is the martial arts ideal. And so the attraction of martial arts to me was, this will allow me to live a quiet life. This will allow me to live a non-violent life. I'm not interested in demonstrating my masculinity. I'm not interested in puffing my chest out, flexing my muscles, getting in people's faces with my manliness. And so that's one of the reasons I was drawn to martial arts in the first place. Was I was like, okay, this is a place where you learn how to control your ego. This is a place where you learn how to control your fear. This is a place where you learn that self-control, that discipline, and you can just then quietly go about your business and live your life. That was the attraction. And let me just say that that's, that was the attraction for me. I think that is the attraction. I think that is one of the reasons martial arts, traditional martial arts especially, attract a lot of people, for some of those reasons. But don't get me wrong, you meet loads of people who want to fight, who are very outwardly, obviously aggressive, who love competition, who love getting out on the floor and mixing it up, who want to be winners, and who want to intimidate others and be dominant. That's all part of martial arts as well. It's out there, and that's, I'm not critical of that if that stays tethered to the fundamental philosophies of traditional martial arts, which are basically philosophies of non-violence. And that's, as I've said before, that's why I'm not a huge fan of mixed martial arts as it has been, commercialized and commodified and presented and sensationalized by, media, and the sort of the bloodlust that is given full vent in that sport, even though those competitors are very impressive competitors, very impressive fighters, very impressive martial artists. But to me, there is still something excessive. And martial arts, if you're sticking closely to the philosophy, it's not about excess. It's actually about minimalizing that. It's, it's efficient, it's economic, it's not showy. And in a way, how, the type of masculinity that I value is that efficient, economic, not showy. Which is why I swim alone. Because I'm not doing it as a demonstration. I just want to get in the water and swim and get the hell out. And listen, swimming in the sea, swimming in cold water, that's not a masculine thing. This is the madness of it. There are so few things, maybe certain physical endeavours that require a certain level of strength that maybe, proportionally speaking, most women are not capable of. You can go, okay, well, men can withstand that. They're built differently. But like, if you're talking character traits, personality traits, inclinations, personality, orientation, I often kind of go, this is just people. It's not male or female. Now maybe I need to lean into that next week. And I still haven't even answered my own question. What is a man? So this is definitely going to be part one. Because there are so many areas to go with this. And yeah, listen, come on. Who am I kidding? Where do you even, if this is just the beginning, and I'm not sure what I've answered at all. You got a nice character study of my father. That's about it. And maybe a bit of an insight into my own thinking and how I think about masculinity. So maybe I'll pick this up again next week, but I'll definitely be calling this part one, or to be continued. Okay, I've got to go. I will be back next week. It may be continuing this conversation around masculinity. That would make sense, wouldn't it? But as ever, I'm not sure what I'll pick up next week. This is definitely to be continued. This is only a start. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you got something from it. I'd be fascinated whether you're a man or a woman, or if you don't identify as a man or a woman. I'm not sure what you identify as. If you have thoughts on this and want to reach out and go, what the hell are you talking about? Or I really agree, or that's interesting, or no, you're so wrong. Go for it. Let me know. You can leave me a comment on YouTube. You can leave me a comment on Instagram, on Facebook. You can leave me a comment on Twitter, but I won't be looking. Yeah, that would be great. I welcome your involvement. And if you really dig what I'm doing here, please consider supporting this using the Patreon link. That's patreon.com/theclearout. Because it's great to get that level of validation. A few dollars, a few euros a month, a few yen from the Japanese listeners. Onegashimasu. Okay. You know what? I had one other thing. I was going to say, just before I was recording this, I was going, what is masculinity? Who's a good masculine role model? And do you know who came in my head? This is ridiculous. Do you know who came in my head? Papa Smurf. I used to love the Smurfs. Now I realise Papa Smurf is an archetype. The even-tempered, bearded, older man in the community. See, that's my father as well. But Papa Smurf. And then anytime I think of the Smurfs, I always remember the first time I found out what they were referred to as in the French-speaking world. And it's les Schtroumpfs. And that is such a funny word to me. Les Schtroumpfs. Smurf? Fine. I mean, not funny. But Schtroumpf. J'adore les Schtroumpfs. Les Schtroumpfs, ils sont chouettes. Ils sont formidables. J'aime beaucoup les Schtroumpfs. I love the Schtroumpfs. Anyway, Papa Smurf. He's a good guy, isn't he? Jolly guy. So, I thought that was funny. Okay, well, it's good. Listen, that's all that matters. As long as I'm entertaining myself, who cares? I will be back next week. It may be a continuation of this conversation, this monologue, this tell. You'll find out next week by listening to The Clear Out. All the best. Lots of love. Mind yourselves. Be a man. Or don't. It's all good. And what is a man anyway? I'll talk to you soon. See ya. Bye.